Alright, folks, we're almost done with the muscle system. So this is 10-6, energy sources in muscle. Well, ATP is the most immediate source of energy for muscle contraction. And you probably know that because you realize that it takes ATP to cock the myosin heads. So let's back up and just work our way backwards and see where the ATP comes from. Well, most of our ATP comes from the mitochondria. Our mitochondria makes 34 of the 36 ATP, or you could say 34 of, well, it's 36 or 38 depending how you look at it. And I don't really want to get into why sometimes it's 36 and why sometimes it's 38, but the ATP makes most of, or the mitochondria makes most of your ATP. Now the ATP is only worth a couple seconds of muscle contraction. So we better be constantly making ATP, and we in fact are. What happens is we burn glucose. We metabolize glucose to make ATP. And and we say that like it's the only thing we burn, but we can burn fatty acids and we can even burn proteins. But glucose is probably the primary source, and we actually have to burn glucose to be able to burn fatty acids and proteins. The way a biochemistry book states it is that fatty acids and proteins burn in the fires of carbohydrates. So you actually need to be burning glucose while you're burning fatty acids and proteins. So we burn the glucose, and you make ATP, and you continue contracting the muscle. Now we will talk about a so the ATP is only worth a couple seconds, but then I get a few more seconds out of another energy source called creatine monophosphate or just creatine phosphate. And we can store energy source, we can store creatine phosphate for some muscle contractions, but that only buys us another dozen seconds or so. So ultimately, what we have to be doing, what our muscle has to be doing, is we have to be burning energy stores like fatty acids, and we have to be burning energy stores like glycogen to keep our muscle contracting. Now, while our muscle is at rest, what happens is it stores glycogen, and our adipocytes store fatty acids. So then, when our muscle is contracting, we draw from those energy reserves. We break down the fatty acids, we break down the glycogen to make our ATP. During activity, you can see that here that we're making ATP, and this is powering the muscle contraction. You can see we're breaking down glycogen into glucose, and we're burning the glucose to make ATP. And you can see that we're burning the fatty acids to make ATP. Now, this is aerobic respiration, and for the most part, humans do aerobic respiration. We have very short periods of time where we can ferment, short periods of anaerobic, and that is only short periods. So, short periods of anaerobic metabolism. Most of our metabolism is in the presence of oxygen, and we're burning fatty acids and glycogen and making ATP from that. Now, when are we anaerobic? Well, it's during peak activity. And the reason being is that we are contracting the muscle beyond the ability, faster than it requires to burn fatty acids and glycogen. So we keep contracting the myofibers, and we don't have enough time to break down the fatty acids by beta oxidation or the glycogen by hydrolysis and make all this ATP. So what we do is we just keep running the shorter pathway called glycolysis, which is glucose to pyruvate and glucose to pyruvate and glucose to pyruvate. But to keep running that short pathway, we have to do this lactic acid fermentation pathway. And we have to do that, and this is done anaerobically. Now this can't occur forever, obviously. It can't even occur very long, really. This will change the pH of your blood, and it will change and things like that. Plus, you have to recycle the lactic acid. Lactate and lactic acid are the same thing. It just has to do with whether it's protonated or not. All right, so this is peak activity, and this would be the anaerobic metabolism. This is the collage showing you at rest. At rest, we store glycogen and fatty acids. Moderate activity, we're doing it in the presence of oxygen. Peak activity, we can't keep up with the muscle contraction by aerobic respiration. So we do this anaerobic lactic acid production. And we can only do that for a short period of time. Now that lactic acid has to be recycled, and this picture is not in your book, but I want to show you. What happens is the lactic acid from the muscles go to the liver, and the liver converts it back into glucose, and that goes back to the muscle to be burned again. Now remember, this muscle can't burn glucose and make lactic acid for very long, but yes, this is a vicious cycle for a short period of time, and this is called the Cori cycle because a husband and wife scientific team, Gert Cori and Henry Cori, I think, or maybe it's Henri and Gertie. I think that's the name. By the way, I think I spelled Gertie wrong. Anyway, you can look up the Coris. They're a husband-wife combination, and they discovered this Cori cycle of how we recycle lactic acid. While we're recycling lactic, okay, so ask yourself this. You just sprinted 200 yards, and you're done. Why are you still breathing hard? You're not running anymore. I mean, think about it. Why are you still breathing hard if you're not running anymore? And the answer is this. You have an oxygen debt. Now, we don't call it oxygen debt anymore. Right now, what we call it is EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So why are you doing that? Well, why you're doing that is because, for one thing, you're running the Cori cycle. That's one reason why you're doing it. Another reason is your muscles were just in an anaerobic phase, and now they're using a lot of that oxygen to make ATP. You've depleted your muscles of ATP. Now you got to replenish them. So you're going to have this oxygen debt, and you're going to have excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, a fancy way of saying you're going to breathe hard when you're done running, for a little while anyway. So that's what's going to happen here, is you have this oxygen debt when you're done exercising, and that's peak exercise. If you're just walking, a slow walk, you're not going to have an oxygen debt, and when you stop walking, you're not going to be breathing hard. This tells you, this is probably important. It's not important to memorize these numbers for the sake of the numbers. It's important to know, to maybe have a sense of these numbers so that you know how we switch from one source of energy to another. Your ATP is only worth a couple seconds. That's it. All the ATP that's in your muscles right now, if you start contracting them, it's only going to last you a couple seconds. Creatine monophosphate will give you another, I said dozen seconds a few minutes ago, and this table says 15 seconds. It's about the same. So creatine monophosphate will give you another 15 seconds of muscle contraction or activity. And then you got to start breaking down their glycogen that's immediately inside your muscle. And what you do is you break down your glycogen, and if you do it anaerobically, it's worth about 2 minutes. But that can only happen briefly, actually 2 minutes, say. It can only happen for about 2 minutes. And then you must start aerobically metabolizing. All right. So now you're breaking down your glycogen, and you're good for almost an hour. So this is how you switch over from one energy source to another. Now you're going to say, I work out longer than an hour. Sure you do, because this table doesn't have fatty acids and proteins in there. So yeah, I can do that. I can add more time to your workout. You can burn fatty acids and you can burn proteins. All right. So have a sense of those numbers. That helps you. And by the way, you can see number of twitches as well, although I wasn't going into that kind of detail. I mean, this is the number of twitches that those 2 seconds of ATP are worth, or the number of twitches that the 15 seconds of creatine monophosphate are worth. That's it, folks. Next lecture is the final one for muscle tissue.